So hi guys, my name is Ryan and I am a project management intern. And so I'll be sharing some of the work I did this summer. So I was assigned to two projects this summer. The first one was called Entity Resolution, which was a technical project I helped manage where we had multiple banks come together and try and build a proof of concept machine learning model that would benefit them from a use case that applies to all of them. But the second one is called Accelerate AI. And this one is a non-technical project. It's a thought leadership project. And so in the interest of time, instead of talking about both, I thought I'd pick just Accelerate AI and kind of dive a bit deeper on what we did and what was learned so I can share some of those lessons with you guys. So the goal of Accelerate AI was to see if Vector Institute could bring its various sponsors together and co-create a sort of AI playbook that establishes a framework for successful AI adoption and implementation. And so the Accelerate AI team would then try and summarize all the lessons brought forward and the insights into a white paper. And how we approached this project was we split up the work into three work streams: business and governance, technology and operations, and legal and compliance. And so I was responsible for business and governance. My fellow intern Rex was responsible for technology and operations, and Deanna was responsible for legal and compliance, who I believe is going to be doing a presentation later this session as well. And so these work sessions consisted of group sessions over Zoom with the sponsors representatives to discuss all the different challenges that they faced and some of the practices that they have kind of learned over their careers. And so we also had sponsors, deliver presentations on some of the projects they've done and the lessons they learned through those projects. And so they contributed what their knowledge to each of these three work streams respectively. And so throughout this process in the past 4 months, the Accelerate AI team has been consolidating kind of everything that they've been putting forward into this kind of unified body of knowledge. And hopefully we'll be publishing that into a white paper soon. So why was the Accelerate AI project created? Well, if we look at the ecosystem across Canada for AI, we can see it's quite flourishing with lots of investments being made. For example, venture capitalists invested over $1 billion into AI initiatives last year, which is up 50% from 2018. And the amount of AI companies that specialize in a specific AI service or product has doubled in the past 5 years. And generous investments from the public sector and from the government as well. So the takeaway from here is that there's an economic imperative here for businesses to adopt AI if they don't want to be left behind their competition, because it's clear that the momentum of AI is not slowing down anytime soon. But the thing is, AI adoption can be very challenging for a lot of these companies. And so to illustrate this, MIT Sloan Review conducted a survey in 2020 assessing whether businesses believe they are generating value from their AI initiatives. And it was revealed that while these companies are increasing their attempts at adopting AI, only few of these are reporting significant financial benefits. So for example, one of the questions they asked is, does your business understand how AI will generate value? You can see majority of them are claiming that they do understand how that value will be generated. But then when we ask questions on, do they actually have a strategy for AI and do they have a pilot in place? We can see that there's increased attempts at implementing and adopting AI, but what they found was that only 11% of organizations are reporting significant financial benefits in 2020. So the question is, what are the kind of challenges these companies are facing? Well, according to another survey by McKinsey, they found key differences between high-performing AI companies and low-performing AI companies. And so how they found this was that they asked questions assessing the strength of these specific components to a business, for example, strategy, talent, leadership, culture, and whatnot. And they divided up the positive responses to these questions between high-performing AI companies and the low-performing or mid-performing. And what we see is there's a clear delta, a clear difference between all of them for all of these components of the business, which means that challenges for AI lie in each one of these kind of components. So we decided to sort of structure the document according to this and approach the project by asking detailed questions about challenges in these areas. And so another way we also approach the project in structuring a document is structuring in a way that it kind of goes through the typical life cycle of an AI project, starting from the beginning and then moving to the end. So the first things we want to talk about is or the document talks about is sort of the best practices and challenges in setting up AI projects. Now, the full body of knowledge is like about 75 slides long. For my work stream only, the entire document is about 300 slides. So I did my best to try and summarize as much as I could, but in the interest of time, it's going to be very high levels. But feel free to reach out to the Accelerate AI team if you want to have sort of like the more access to the more detailed version of this. So the first thing that we eventually kind of realized from the insights gathered from sponsors is that establishing AI literacy at the beginning of the project is something that's really important. And that's because managers, leaders, and other non-technical stakeholders that have a weak understanding of what AI is and what it takes to make it work will result in it being very difficult to build AI projects at scale to success. So the first goal is to be establishing AI literacy. And like I mentioned, the document that we're building goes into a lot of details on how to go about doing that exactly. And then once you kind of established AI literacy, then your stakeholders are in a better position to evaluate what kind of use cases, but what kind of use cases you should be looking at, but how, what are the kind of methodologies one should use to select use cases. So throughout the project and through some of the research that Vector's been doing, we kind of found that there's 4 general perspectives on how to select AI solvable use cases. And the first one is by looking at specifically problem input. And we analyze problem input by looking at 2 different dimensions of problem input. The first one being the complexity of the data. So we want to know how unstructured or structured it is, how volatile it is, the volume. And then the second type of dimension of a problem input is the work itself and the complexity there. Is it routine? Is it predictable? Or is it judgment based? And so assessing and analyzing those 2 dimensions can kind of help you figure out whether you can use AI for this use case or not. And again, so in the document, we go through a lot of different frameworks on how to do that in much more detail. And the second perspective is kind of the opposite, where we kind of start with the end. We kind of focus on the type of output we're trying to generate. So for example, are you trying to improve operations efficiency or customer discovery, for example? And then kind of work your way backwards and seeing whether you have sort of the AI infrastructure and resources to actually do that. Another type of perspective is by assessing the problem type itself. So for example, say you have like a specific idea on how you want to make use of the data that you're sitting on, but you're not sure how AI can do that. Well, in general, AI generates value from 4 data-driven problems, and that is AI is effective at assignment type problems, grouping, generation, and forecasting or prediction. And finally, very simply, you can just simply look at use cases other players in the industry have tackled to kind of inspire your own use cases. So once you've selected a use case, usually next step is to acquire buy-in from stakeholders, but there are a lot of challenges specific to AI when it comes to securing buy-in. And that usually revolves around the hype around AI. So people kind of have wild expectations of what AI can do. So it's really important to establish the limitations of what AI can do and exactly what are its strengths and weaknesses. And then another kind of important point to that discussion is who needs to buy in. Organizations that typically focus on acquiring buy-in from only leadership via top-down approach may not be able to assess all the risks. But instead, if you were to have feedback and risk assessment from working teams and across the organization, then you might be able to anticipate what those risks are in a better way. So once you have your project started and off the ground, how do you ensure the success of those active AI projects? Well, the first thing you do is, of course, make sure you have talent that can actually build your AI. And so when it comes to securing talent, the type of challenges that are faced are a lot. I guess one of the ones I'll point out is evaluating candidates. A lot of companies may not have hiring personnel that are not data scientists or AI scientists themselves, and so not in the greatest position to evaluate skill sets. One of sort of the suggestions around this is to switch to something called competency-based hiring, where we look at 4 different dimensions of competency that's shown here, and then figuring out, according to the different roles that you want to fill out, what are the different levels of each competency each role needs to fill out. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's kind of a starting point for a company that is sort of just starting out. And then once you have talent, another set of challenges that companies face is retaining their talent. So usually one of the reasons why this is so challenging is that the reason why there's such high turnover rate is that sometimes AI scientists and data scientists kind of have different expectations. They may come from academic settings and may not adjust well to corporate settings. So the solution to this is to let your participants, not your participants, your talent participate in conferences and publish papers as well. Another really important factor to success of AI projects is adopting the right type of culture. AI is very experimental in nature, and so legacy companies that have kind of rigid frameworks may not be able to embrace the experimentation of AI and the non-linear development of AI. So it's really important to try and see if you can assess whether you need a cultural shift. And then finally, not finally, but one of the important aspects to ensuring success of active projects is selecting the right type of processes for AI development. So something that kind of became very clear throughout our working sessions is that Agile is definitely the go-to flavor of managing AI projects, probably not a surprise to the audience here. But the question is, which flavors are optimal for AI? We found that from people's experiences that the more rigid flavors of Agile are just not very suitable. And that's because development of AI, like I mentioned, can be very experimental in nature and nonlinear. So rigid frameworks that focus on short-term gains may not be able to really capture the full value of AI. So the best practice is sort of focus on the more flexible Agile frameworks that focus more on tasks and approaches rather than fixing allocated units of time. And then towards the end of the project lifecycle, usually when your proof of concept is kind of being assessed of whether you want to scale it up to production, there's some kind of challenges and best sort of suggestions on how to capture the full value of what you've been working on. And so there's a lot of stuff that we go into detail in the full document, but like the takeaway is to make sure you're continually checking whether your proof of concept during the development, that it still remains in alignment with the original goals and budget. After months or years of developing a proof of concept, it can kind of run away and kind of transform into something that is extremely costly to scale up. So another really important aspect to ensuring the success of AI adoption is having proper AI governance and oversight. And for those that are not very familiar what this entails, well, AI governance is the ability to direct, manage, and monitor the AI activities of an organization in alignment with the principles and values of the company. And so it's kind of universally recognized that it's very important across businesses. But the challenges that are faced here really revolve around the fact that there just isn't a universal AI governance standard to follow. So it's kind of uncharted territory. So the way we are kind of like approaching and structuring the government and structuring the document and putting together all the consolidated insights and lessons from all the sponsors is that we want to look at traditional governance frameworks that are already in place and then figuring out how to tweak those to make them better augmented and just optimal for AI. We can't reinvent the wheel for governance because they're giant, infrastructures and these giant corporate entities. So it makes more sense to try and tweak and augment rather than try and build from scratch. Another kind of approach that the document is taking and going into a lot more detail than I can provide here is defining what problematic AI governance looked like. Because if you can define what is problematic, then it's just easier to figure out what to stay away from when you're building your AI governance standards. So to summarize kind of like what the document is kind of like, the type of like examples of problematic governance that we have in our document so far, well, it can be kind of summarized as like the Band-Aid approach that people typically use when they're dealing with something they never dealt with before, where they just kind of solve problems as they pop up without having sort of a governance system built from the beginning that is suited and optimized for AI. And then finally, the document goes into some of the suggested best practices that we gathered from the participants and the sponsors of the project and from research that Vector has conducted as well. This part of the document is still in the middle of being built and fleshed out, so I can't really share much detail about this yet. But like I said, feel free to reach out to the Accelerate AI team if you're interested in knowing kind of a little bit more about how the document is shaping, and we might be able to send you a version that has more information that I've been able to provide here. So that covers what we did for Accelerate AI. So thank you for your time. I'll open up the floor to any Q&A.